What brings us together today is the launch of Lockdown Lit at Lunch. It's a weekly salon right here on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Pacific time. Lockdown Literature is a group of authors with books published during the coronavirus pandemic who have banded together to support one another. You can find a full list of Lockdown Lit authors and their new books at booksmith.com. All books are available for sale or pre-order now, and we'll deliver them straight to your door. I'll drop the links into the chat here in a bit. This first event features Clare Beams for her novel, The Illness Lesson, and Rachel Vorona Cote for her book, Too Much, How Victorian Constraints Still Bind Women Today. If you have questions for today's authors at any point, please feel free to add them in the comments and we'll pass them along. I'm going to turn things over now to my friend and yours, Zyzzyva's managing editor, Oscar Villalon, who will serve as today's MC. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Well, all right, thank you, Evan, and thank you everyone for tuning in for this, the first in our weekly series. I'll introduce our two authors for today. The first is Clare Beams. She's the author of the novel, The Illness Lesson, just published by Doubleday, as well as the story collection, We Show What We Have Learned, which won the Bread Prize and was a Kirkus Best Debut of 2016, as well as a finalist for the Bingham Prize, the New York Public Library's Young Lines Fiction Award, and the Shirley Jackson Award. In its starred review of The Illness Lesson, Kirkus had this to say of the book: Beams takes risk after risk in this, her first novel, and they all seem to pay off. Her ventriloquizing of the late 19th century, her delicate as lace sentences, and the friction between the unsettling thinking of the period and its 21st century resonances make for an electrifying read. A satisfyingly strange novel from the one-of-a-kind Beams. Claire's joining us. I guess she's in Pittsburgh, where she teaches creative writing, most recently at Carnegie Mellon and at Pittsburgh Center for the Arts. Claire, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
And our other author is Rachel Vorona Cote. She's the author of Too Much, How Victorian Constraints Still Bind Women Today, published by Grand Central Publishing. The Washington Independent Review of Books had this to say of her book: Too Much defies easy categorization. It is as much a memoir as a work of impressive scholarship. It is as comfortable parsing the cultural meaning surrounding Britney Spears' public disintegration as it is analyzing the feminine mores conveyed in obscure 18th century texts aimed at improving girls and women. Cote publishes frequently in such outlets as the New Republic, Rolling Stone, Literary Hub, Catapult, and the LA Review of Books, and she was previously a contributing writer at Jezebel. She was ABD in the doctoral program in English at the University of Maryland, studying and teaching the literature of the Victorian period. She and her husband live in Tacoma Park, just outside of Washington, D.C. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you both for being here. And before I turn it over, just I guess a little bit about what will be discussed today, both books by both authors. And my understanding is we'll touch on some ideas about hysteria and the policing and regulating of women's bodies and the role all of that plays in each of their books. So without further ado, welcome.
Thank you so much. Rachel, do you have a preference about who reads first? I should have asked you this before.
No.
Okay. Should I? Okay, I'll take it away. Okay, so thank you so much to Booksmith and to Zyzzyva. This is such a pleasure. And Lockdown Lit has been it's been such a balm in this time, I think, to those of us who've had books come out during this like strange and unprecedented series of events. And I'm so excited I get to talk to Rachel today. I love her book so much. So I'm going to read just like 2 pages from my book, and it's kind of from the middle, so I do have to tell you just a little bit about the book so that it makes some kind of sense. So we are at a brand new school for girls in 1871, Massachusetts. And this school has been founded on the progressive principle that girls can actually do all the same things that boys can do. Radical principle. So Caroline is our main character, and she is the 29-year-old daughter of the founder of the school, whose name is Samuel Hood. And their third teacher at this new school is named David. And Caroline has found herself increasingly drawn to him as they've begun teaching together. And David has just brought his wife, Sophia, whom Caroline did not know about, to teach at the school alongside them, to teach art. And this is drawn from the scene of her first art lesson. It's also like about when everything is starting to go really wrong at the school. So I'll just start there. Sophia rustled through her papers. "If you're the one being drawn, just sit naturally," she told the girls. The subjects, of course, could not. They held themselves rigidly at carefully chosen angles, the way Caroline had seen them hold themselves before mirrors, small, uncomfortable shiftings as if the eyes of the drawer prickled. Eliza was the only one who sat, subjected to Livia's pencil, much as she always did. She was used to the feel of eyes. Sophia circled the room. Remember proportion. The ones drawing were beginning to prickle now, too. You don't actually look like this, all right? Don't worry, Rebecca said to Meg. I'm hopeless, said Livia. Felicity giggled. You look a little like my uncle. Your uncle? Not like him exactly. It's just he has this expression, this sort of pucker to his lips. I did that to your lips here, see? What is that? Livia said in a different tone. She had put down her pencil and was stretching her hand across the desk toward Eliza's face. There's a red spot in your eye, Eliza. What? What sort of a red spot? Samuel asked. Come see. They closed in. Eliza's fingers hung in the air, wondering where to press. Which eye, she said. What does it look like? Livia's finger advanced. Instinctively, Caroline batted her hand away. I was just showing, Livia said. Caroline could see it. The red dot began in the gray of Eliza's iris and stretched into the white. It was the size of a ladybug or a very small button, darker in the middle, fading to a haze at its edges. Does it hurt? Sophia asked. Who has a mirror? Eliza said. Julia, of course, produced one. Eliza held it before her face, widening her eyes at herself in the glass. Here was the posing that had been missing before as she tilted herself for the best view. She touched the outer corner of the afflicted eye, then stared at her fingertip as if she thought it might come away bloody. It looks like a little red sun, Rebecca said. No, Samuel said. No, it looks like what it is, a bit of a hurt place. You must have bumped your eye, Miss Bell, that's all. I didn't, I really didn't. Come, you can't possibly remember all the discomforts you feel in a given day, Samuel said briskly. And the eye is unusual territory. It has its own way of registering complaints, quite apart from the nerves. A simple broken blood vessel, probably, David said. Eliza's fingers tented over the skin just to the side of her eye, then flew away. I can't see, she said wildly. Her eyes fluttered. I can't. Miss Bell, of course you can. Let us remain ourselves. Though Caroline could hear the effort in Samuel's voice, she doubted any of the others could. You saw perfectly well until Miss Bunting pointed this little injury out, didn't you? A problem so feeble as that isn't a problem at all. And I can tell you can see you're looking at me. Let us remain ourselves. Yes, let us. One constant in Caroline's life, how much better she could feel when her father was talking. Eliza's hands flapped. There's a place where I can't see, a hole, she gasped. Shouldn't we fetch the physician? She's saying there's something wrong, said Sophia. Wouldn't she know? Once a suggestion enters the mind, it can be difficult to know what we usually know, said Samuel, collecting himself, smoothing this particular circumstance into a feature of human nature. Caroline stepped forward and touched Eliza's hand. We'll keep watch on it. She'd almost said keep an eye. We'll do next whatever is needed. Samuel clapped briskly, trying to force a different rhythm on the room. But for now, girls, portraiture awaits you. You want me to pretend this isn't happening? Cried Eliza. Very little has actually happened, but no, I only meant to suggest that there are questions at hand worthier of your talents and energies, Miss Bell. The question of proportion, as you rightly suggested, Mrs. Moore, among other artistic matters, I'm sure. Tell us, what else should the girls attend to? Sophia hesitated. Well, shading, she said, and line. The girls were sitting back down in their places. After a moment, even Eliza, the hollows beneath her eyes wet with tears. Shading and line, Samuel said. Quiet fell as they drew. Caroline watched Olivia's pencil, waiting to see it bore into Eliza's eye on the page. Her own eye watered. And I'll stop there.
Oh, I love that scene so much. So I guess I'll go ahead and read and then we'll talk.
That sounds great. Yeah.
So when Claire and I were talking about what we were going to do for this event, we were sort of thinking about what readings might make a sort of sense together, particularly with regards to what we wanted to talk about. And so even though often when I read from my book, I read from the introduction, or I read parts that tend to be more cultural criticism, I thought that instead today I would read a little bit about my mother, who, with whom I had a wonderful, but as most parental-child relationships are, complex. We had a complex relationship, but a wonderful one. And so what I'm going to read is a little anecdote, and all you really need to know about it is that in 8th grade, I was assigned an autobiographical project. It was something every 8th grader had to do. And for one of the chapters, we had to write a satire, and I chose as my topic the sort of social ecosystem of our school. And I got in trouble for it. I was the headmaster, told my parents that I was going to have to rewrite it because I was perhaps pointing out some things about popularity and whatnot. So anyway, my mother was pretty pissed about it. So one day, in the midst of this imbroglio, my English teacher asked me to meet with her and the other notoriously intimidating 8th grade English teacher after my last class. Certain that I was bound for punishment, I agonized for the remainder of the day and asked my best friend to wait for Mom at carpool so she could explain why I wasn't there. In my terror, it apparently never occurred to me to call home. Once the meeting began, my fears were assuaged. They supported me wholeheartedly, these teachers assured me, and they were going to ensure that I did not have to rewrite my essay in order to placate my classmates or their parents. My stricken limbs loosened, and I began to breathe with regularity. Until, as if on cue, Mom appeared at the classroom threshold, windswept and wild-eyed. She was as furious as I had ever seen her, and before I could assure her that all was well, she settled her white-hot glare on this pair of unsuspecting teachers and drew a full-bodied breath. The court of Catherine Florio Verona was in session. My daughter has been treated like shit at this school for nearly 2 years, she snarled. I'm ashamed to say that garden variety teenage embarrassment nullified what should have been pride. I broke in as quickly as I could, all agitation and squirms. Mom, it's okay. They're on my side. I'm not in trouble. But in retrospect, Mom stormed into that classroom like Athena on a righteous rampage. She was a warrior waving the banner of motherly justice, determined to defend her daughters from the perils of juvenile nastiness. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate this, didn't appreciate her. Certainly, my reaction was born in part from snotty adolescent panic over my own reputation. Mom was an extension of me, and if her behavior raised eyebrows or if my classmates overheard this wrath-soaked expostulation, I would be mocked for it. After all, earnest, outsized reactions, a quintessential aspect of Mom's too-muchness and mine, were regarded as absurd and unseemly. Having fully absorbed this ideology, one in which we were premium examples of lesser people, I could not be proud of the mother whose fierce empathy had summoned this act of parental heroism. Instead, I was mortified by her too-muchness, particularly the aspects of it that seemed to have engendered my own. I only saw what I feared becoming, what, in my bones, I knew I already was. Tremulous and sensitive, constitutionally incapable of feeling anything by half. These were traits that oriented my mother and that begot what was most precious in her. She may have been predisposed to empathy, but she also chose it, cultivated it, and even when it burned. It took me years to interpret her fire as something exquisite and rare. Finally, I understood that those flames blazing within her, scorching her, had lovingly kept me warm. And I'll stop there.
I love that so much. I love your mom's presence in the whole book. I just think it's such an amazing, I read that scene and it's like, you can't help feeling it from the kid perspective of like, your parents are just so humiliating in ways that don't make sense down the road, you know, but just that age, it's just, whatever they're doing is like this terrible vulnerability in you, you know? Yeah. But then when I read it now as a parent, I have 2 daughters now, and I just like, if I end up being, it's like exactly what I want to do as a mom, you know? It's like, if I get to embarrass them in that way, I will feel so proud of myself, you know? And so I just think you capture that so well. And I love the sort of double seeing that you have going there, and so often in the scenes about your mom where it's what it looked like then and what it looks like now, you know. It's really beautiful.
Thank you. So, I mean, it sounds, we kept talking about how, like, oh my gosh, we have so much to talk about, and so now where are we even going to begin?
I know. Well, so I mean, I think that our books, I think, really live in sort of the same universe. And reading your book, it was just such a pleasure. I love, just for everyone out there listening, it's this book that what I think is so amazing about it is the way that it folds in both this like omnivorous brain, like just this incredible grasp of so many different kinds of texts and pop culture references and movies. And you know, you're endlessly sort of learning and encountering things you've seen before, but also things you've never seen before. And then also it's folded into this sort of beautiful retelling of these key moments in a life. And so it creates this really personal but very expansive whole that really I think is very special, and so it really, everybody should read it.
Now I'm gonna have to run away and cry.
Well, good.
Thank you, and I mean, and that means so much to me because that's it, that I feel passionately about Claire's novel. One of the first things I said was that if our books hadn't come out within weeks of each other, The Illness Lesson is precisely the sort of book I would have wanted to write about in Too Much, with all love and admiration. I love reading Victorian novels, surprise, but I love neo-Victorian, and which is one of the sort of broad genres that I see The Illness Lesson sort of inhabiting in a really wonderful way, where we get this really capacious and insightful look into history, into our sort of collective history, and in a history of ideologies that are enduring, but we get a chance to see the sorts of things that we simply can't see if we're reading The Woman in White, or if we're reading Wuthering Heights. There's a scene in Jane Eyre where I'm pretty sure Jane is masturbating, but in a book like The Illness Lesson, we get this female sexual subjectivity in just such a lush and vivid way. And so I could also go on for hours, but I truly, I've found, I think like a lot of people, reading has sort of become a sort of different experience for me under lockdown. And The Illness Lesson was one of the first books where I actually felt like myself as a reader.
I feel the same way about yours. So we got very excited when we learned that this event was going to happen, and we had so much fun figuring out what we were going to talk about. But so we settled on this idea of hysteria because I think that one of the things that both books are interested in, these aspects of history that are not really history, right? I mean, they are, but they are also contemporary. And sort of this idea of the hysterical woman feels so central to sort of both of our books. And I loved, you had a couple of just amazing lines about hysteria that I sort of just underlined so hard it almost ripped the page when I was reading. You had written, a hysterical woman is above all an inappropriate one. Oh geez, I don't know why that's happening, sorry. That shouldn't. Okay.
It would not be an online event if that didn't happen.
I don't know how to make that. Let's see. Okay. All right. 1 second. Let's see. I even have do not. I'm sorry, guys. This will stop in a second.
While you're doing that, I'm going to show everybody the covers of both our books.
Humanizes us, right? There we go. Oh, good. I'm muted and unmuted. Okay. Sorry, guys. That should not happen again. You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to turn this off and hopefully that will. I never have totally understood why that occurs. One quick second. If I close this, that should help.
Okay. My husband has been using my computer to teach, and before he figured out how to fix it, he would be like teaching, and then there'd be like ding ding ding. So
yeah, and I don't know, it's like you think you've muted it 6 different ways, but it's just, but anyway, so I love this idea of sort of hystericism as like sort of too muchness, basically, as sort of as the guiding principle of your book. And then also you have this line that I loved later on: how should the body feel to the woman living in it? And I just think that is such a sort of fascinating idea, sort of this who is it that gets to decide what things should feel like to women. And so I thought maybe we could sort of start there with, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of how that idea plays out in the wonderful constellation of texts and experiences that you've assembled for your book. I mean, not you don't have to be exhaustive in addressing this, but you know, if that what you see is sort of the particular threat of that idea, of this question of like, how should things feel, and who decides what is appropriate and inappropriate?
Well, I think what's so interesting is that question sort of dovetails so maybe not a surprise so much with what one of the things that I wanted to ask you about. And I think, and it's something that we see beautifully examined in your book, and maybe what I'll do is talk a little bit and then turn things specifically to the illness lesson. I think that and now I don't have a background in medicine, but there is a sort of enduring narrative of women being unreliable narrators, women being fundamentally unreliable narrators of our own experience. And I think that and that is something that is really pernicious in all sorts of ways. We see it when a woman comes forward to say that she's been sexually assaulted, and we also see it in this very specifically physical way when a woman says that she's in pain, that she thinks that maybe she has endometriosis, or that she feels something in her body, and so I think that there is this tension that's been created for women identified persons, I'd say, as of what we feel, what we think we feel, that of course after you absorb a certain amount of after you absorb the sort of atmosphere in which you live, you start to hold yourself and your own experiences and your own sensations suspect. So there's that. So we've got that sort of lived experience, and then there are the messages, the narratives, the stories that we're sort of told about what is happening to us in capital letters, whether what it is that we remembered, whether we're talking about Freud and his account of Dora that you write about so beautifully in Lit Hub, or we're talking about Christine Blasey Ford testifying before Congress, and I think one of one of the things that is so compelling and fascinating about the world that you create in the illness lesson. One of the things that I started thinking about is that the book feels to me as if it's as much about the preconditions for harm as it is about the harm itself. And, and then that has everything to do with the people that that sort of populate this very intimate community that you've created. We have these girls who are supposed to be, theoretically, they're supposed to be learning to take themselves seriously, to take what they think seriously, to become, it's almost, this is like the nerd in me, but it becomes a sort of authorial agency sort of thing where they're supposed to trust themselves, trust their subjectivity. But then, as all of a sudden they begin to exhibit these mysterious and really dreadful symptoms, well, that doesn't matter, because actually, what's most important is that this different narrative be impressed upon them. And so I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about that, about what you were thinking in terms of creating these characters of Samuel and David, these sort of purportedly progressive men who really open the doors to some really tragic circumstances.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that is really sort of what the book is about at the end of the day, is this sort of these well-meaning but like willfully blind men who make the real evil possible. I mean, I think there's a horrifying medical treatment that the girls are subjected to that's sort of at the hands of this very kind of just walking evil doctor. But the doctor can only do damage because Samuel, who is not uncomplicatedly evil, lets him in. And I think in that way, Samuel is really the villain of the book. Even though it takes Caroline a really long time to understand that. Yeah. And I think that to me, the book is really about sort of this project that is noble, that is this idea that girls can do what boys can do and should, yes, as you said, sort of have agency over themselves and should trust themselves, but only as long as those selves are in accordance with Samuel's vision for those selves. And that is sort of the ultimate, that's the contradiction that they're being sort of forced to live in at the school. And I think that to me, when I started writing, I knew that the girls would cause trouble and that the trouble would have to come from their bodies in some way, because that's sort of what has not been allowed space at the school. There's this idea that girls can do what boys can do, but there's been no space made for the fact that these girls' experience up until this point has been different because of who they are, and that after they leave this school, that will sort of continue to be true, and that might create tensions for them that might not exist if they were the boys that everyone is sort of pretending that they are. And so I think that the book is really about what happens when you let somebody else have authority over your own experience, before, like when you trust someone else's vision for what's happening to you more than you trust your own. And I think that is exactly sort of the dilemma that Caroline is living with for most of the book. And it takes her a long time to kind of grow out of that, I think. And I think that is still very much something that exists. And you had a wonderful line, I wrote it down, I hope I can find it. This is, you discussed this, I think, within the context of talking about an etiquette book, but with sort of the implication that it carries over to today. Being oneself was welcomed so long as that self was stringently groomed with the paramount goal of appealing to everybody and offending no one. And I think that's very much true today. This idea of be yourself, don't make anybody mad. Don't say anything that's like controversial. Be yourself, but be very nice if you're a girl. And it is a fascinating thing to sort of watch. And it's there from very early on with the way we talk to little girls and the way that the stories that we tell them sort of shape them.
And it's almost as if, I think what can be so frustrating about it is that we know we know how harmful that sort of rhetoric is. I mean, we talk about it, and it's almost as if we can have these larger conversations about civility and how civility in politics is a problem. We're all seeing that in a really big way now.
I don't know what you mean.
I'm just sort of talking
Right.
broadly here.
Broadly.
It's not like I can't leave my house at any time and like go to a coffee shop or something, but yeah, it's, and I think what the thing that I really that I wanted to get at when I was writing about what I call too muchness, or excess emotion, being excessive, it's not that being excessive is necessarily fundamentally good or fundamentally bad. It just is. But what is a danger is, and what is harmful is the sort of is this pathologizing, that the pathologizing of certain ways of being, because then you're not even talking about it's like, let's take your character Eliza for example. We could talk about Eliza in terms of is she a kind person? Do we trust her? There are those sorts of issues, and those issues have nothing to do with the fact that these men who are swarming around her have decided that she's simply hysterical and and is acting out, and and needs to be sort of repackaged in a way that they can handle, and in a way that fits.
Right. And I think that's the problem, is with the sort of, with the too muchness, which I just love as this guiding principle in your book. It's right. It's not so much that that's inherently a noble quality. It's just that you can't expect something that's too much to fit in a smaller space without causing some damage. So.
And I think, one of the things, talking about Caroline, who I just love as a protagonist, I love the way her particular sort of emotional and sort of an intellectual journey, for lack of a better word. It feels very like Tolkien. The way
through a book, so at least she goes somewhere.
The way that she sort of has to finds her footing, because she's ultimately it's a different sort of situation. She's a compromised character, but because she's grown up in this atmosphere, she's been she's been fed a sort of ideology that, yes, that was connected to an atypical education, but it was also, as you said, very much grounded in her father being the sort of guiding light, guiding scholarly and almost spiritual light, and what I really love is that the way that we're able to sort of watch Caroline begin to question and grapple is certainly in these moments with her father, but also the way that she interacts with other women, like Sophia and like Eliza, because there's almost there's some rivalry in the book, and this competition that feels uncomfortable, and I think she knows that, but what were you thinking in terms of Caroline's relationships with women? What sort of, I was really, one of the billions of things that I loved was the way that you crafted these relationships and what that allowed you to sort of suss out about her.
I think Sophia and Eliza both, in early drafts of the book, I just very majorly shortchanged them as characters. And this is a thing I have a tendency to do in early drafts of fiction. I am not a writer who really starts from character, and I think that as a result of that, I tend to start with like sound and sentences. And I think one of the dangers of that is that you can end up in this place where the characters that your main character doesn't like are just like way too simply awful. And that was definitely true of both of those, both Eliza and Sophia, for a really long time. And I have major blind spots about it for a long time as a writer too. I sort of noticed one day, like, why is she being so mean here? Like, she must have some reason. Like, it's not, people can just like walk around and decide to be mean generally. Like, and so I think in the case of those two characters, Caroline has been sort of pining for David before she knew about Sophia's existence. So she is predisposed to find Sophia kind of silly and beneath her. And in some ways, Sophia has not had the same education that Caroline has, but it will turn out that Sophia, because of that, because she's not sort of encumbered by all the deference to Samuel that Caroline has just been steeped in growing up, she is able to act with some moral clarity a little earlier than Caroline can, even though Caroline can see that what they're doing is wrong, but it is very difficult for her to trust her judgment above her father's. And Sophia hasn't really been, she hasn't been taught many of the things Caroline has been taught, but she also hasn't been taught that not to trust herself, you know? And so I think once I sort of figured that out, the book got a lot better once I allowed those two characters to be more sympathetic. And once I sort of figured out ways to let that happen within the story. And Eliza, I think, her sort of function in the story is to cause trouble. And so for a while, she was just sort of doing that too simply. And then I started to think about sort of what her life has looked like.
Yeah.
This is sort of some backstory I don't really need to get into, but basically she's the daughter of a former rival of Samuel's who wrote this kind of potboiler of like a sort of trashy Gothic novel. And
novel that women should not read because it stirs the senses.
I loved that section of your book so much. I was reading it and thinking it's just so much fun it was really fun to write. I start the chapters in the book with these little passages from the bad novel that Eliza's father wrote. And those passages were once much longer, again, in earlier drafts, just because I had so much fun like writing the bad Gothic novel. It does turn out that like, no matter how much fun you have writing a bad book, like it's still kind of a bad book and not as much fun to read maybe as it is to write. Although, I don't know, I had fun reading the parts in your book that were drawn from, I think I mostly had fun reading your analysis of these terrible books. So Eliza is sort of, Caroline kind of invites her in almost to stir up trouble, but then there is a sort of inherent rivalry between them before they even start interacting, just because of who they each have been in each other's mythology, really. And I started thinking, though, about Eliza really has never had much attention for herself ever. And so her whole life is kind of about finding ways, subconsciously mostly, I think, but finding ways to have that. And that is not an evil impulse. You know, she is not, I have tremendous sympathy for her. And she is actually the character that at the end of the book, I sort of worry the most for in lots of ways. But yeah, so I think that those relationships turned out between Caroline and these two other characters in particular, the group of girls too, but I think those two in particular turned out to be very fundamental to the book, and turned out to be something that took some work, but once I made them more complex, I could feel that the book was like finding itself a little bit. Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. So a couple other things I wanted to make sure I got to ask you about. Another section that I found so fascinating. You have this whole passage about what you call the over-reading of female bodies, which I just thought was such a beautiful way of putting that. It's folded in with these etiquette texts that are these amazing sort of how-to guides about like all the things you must not do with your voice, all the things you must not do with your face, and like must not do with your hands, and with as I'm like waving my hands around. But then there's also a section on, there was a sort of physical analysis of like prisoners' bodies, so like murderess's arm length, and I found that to be such a fascinating and kind of telling, just a really illuminating way of thinking about sort of men's approach to women's sort of external selves. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of what you see as sort of the risks of that, or how you see it carrying over into today. I mean, where doesn't it? But I think just, it was a concept that I sort of loved, and this idea, and it felt like it tied into this idea to me of sort of the policing of women's selves, maybe starting with how those selves look and present, I don't know.
It's, it's so hard because, the thing is that, we're never, and this is like such a nerdy thing to say, but because we live in language, and I'm so glad we do, because I get to read language that you write and other wonderful writers, but we're always going to signify something. There's no way to get away from that, away from, a woman being symbolic of X or Y.
Right.
But I think what I think is just so strange, or maybe not strange. I mean, we could, I think, through psychology, we could figure it out, is that on the one, there's so much anxiety surrounding, women, feminine bodies, so much, we're so burdened by these different meanings that, patriarchal ideology places upon us. I mean, like, that's where I think the sort of overreading comes from, we're mothers or angels in the house, or we're whores, or, we're good girls or bad girls. And it's exhausting. And I think what it comes down to is that we end up, just sort of being read as types without, without much concern for or willingness to prioritize our bodily experience, which goes back to your novel. There's so much anxiety surrounding what women do with their bodies, and what what sort of, how we dress and compose ourselves, and yet it seems like we can't get sufficient medical study to understand what a uterus does,
right,
or what a cervix does, or or what the deal is with the clitoris, so it's like it almost seems like tactical disinterest. Like, there's so much anxiety that we can't, that we cannot go there. We can spend a whole lot of time thinking about ways to perfect Viagra, maybe, but we can't. But women are safer when when we sort of try to, when we're rendered two-dimensional.
Yeah.
And
external, I think, like when things seen from the outside, and when we don't look too closely at the inside stuff.
Exactly. And then that outside, you said, has, needs to be, per the conduct books, you need to laugh. You laugh a certain way, you modulate your voice a certain way, you don't gesticulate too much. I would be the worst, because if I sat on my hands, I would not be able to talk.
Neither.
you know, and I think that which and the way that the girls in your book, including Caroline, the way that their bodies insist on themselves and insist to be noticed,
right?
I think is such a it's so beautifully rendered. And that, of course, the way that that's interwoven with the motif of the red birds and one of the things that I think is really wonderful about the project of your book is that you and I don't want to impose a sort of meaning, but you resist so much sort of pat signification. There are so many things, there are so many theories that one could have about what is going on with the girls. There are so many theories that one could have about the birds. In some ways it might be possible to read them as sort of tied to sexuality. There's obviously something very fleshy about them, and then about the nests and the forms that they take. But the book seems so resistant to anything definitive. And what I love about that is it seems to me that you're posing questions that Samuel cannot answer.
Right.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's what I was doing. I mean, I think that I tend as a reader not to like symbols too much when I know what they're up to too quickly and when they kind of line up too neatly. And I'm a very controlling person, and I tend to approach everything except for writing in my life in this extremely type A way. And I tried to do that with writing for a while, and it just turned out that I can't write anything very good that way, because you end up with a whole lot of like symbols that have one direct planned meaning, and so I think that the birds definitely have various ties to the girls' bodies. I did try pretty hard for a while not to know what was up with the birds, so that they would get satisfyingly complicated enough that you couldn't sort of just put them directly down onto the girl's body, but yeah, I think always going to be the kind of writer that's more interested in questions than in answers. And that does frustrate a certain kind of reader, but it's what it is. So yeah.
I love that. And I relate to that a lot, because I'm pretty type A, but hi, Oscar. I'll stop talking.
No, you're fine. I was just about to please finish your thought.
Oh, just that I understand that impulse, that sort of writerly impulse, that you're the sort of person who I feel very reassured by regimen, but I've long found that when it comes to writing, I can't. I've sometimes I find rhythms and then they change.
Right.
It's with writing has been the one, it's certainly one of the things that I have to divest, or I have to allow myself to have a little less control, oddly.
It's hard.
Sounds odd. Yeah.
It does. I kill it when I try to like hold it too tight. So yeah. For a part of it anyway. So.
All right. I was just jumping in just to relate some questions to you from the viewers. And we have quite a few. The first one is for Rachel from Elizabeth. She asks, as a fellow fan of neo-Victorian writing, I'd love to hear what you would recommend or what you've been reading in the genre.
Oh, wait. Well, I haven't been reading in the genre recently, but I do have. I've been reading across so many genres because so many wonderful people have so many wonderful types of books out, and so I'm just kind of grabbing at everything. But I am really excited to read Molly Pollock's. I hope that I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. Molly Pollock's The Unsuitable, which it came out was it March, maybe April. Came out in April, I think, from Henry Holt, and I think it's like a gothic horror, and there's I think some mother-daughter tension, which is sort of very, very gothic. But and so I'm really excited for that. But I would also say that if you haven't read, say, Wilkie Collins, if you haven't read The Woman in White, then you've got to start there. And one of the things I love about the sensation writer in Claire's book is that he's kind of like an off-brand Wilkie Collins, and it's just
Collins with no talent.
And so absolutely, head there. Also, absolutely read Claire's book, read The Unsuitable by Molly, and oh gosh, and I'm gonna like think of like 10 more. I'm kind of like looking over at my bookshelves. But that should get you started. And I tweet about these things, so I'll
come to you and then you'll fill in I never remember specific things when asked in this sort of.
Okay, Jennifer, this is for both of you. Jennifer would like to know, can you both recall the hardest moments in writing your books?
Whew.
Could you relive that pain?
Oh, so much pain. Well, so this book took 7 years, and I started it when I was pregnant with my older daughter. And I had another daughter in the course of writing it and a different book come out. And I think I think there were just times when I worried that I had lost momentum in a kind of fatal way and that it would just never happen. I had a draft of it about 2 years in that took an entirely wrong turn about half to 2/3 the way through. And so it needed this overhaul. And instead of doing that, I was like picking at like the language in the first chapter because that's what's fun for me. And I just didn't know like where I would find that like big chunk of time again to get the whole thing into my head. And I was just really afraid I never would. And it turns out like it just took like a full family effort of, I had ended up with a semester with no teaching in it, not entirely by choice. And we just I talked to my husband and we were like, look, like I had gotten a wonderful grant from the Sustainable Arts Foundation, which funds work by writers and artists with children. And it was like sort of almost what I would have gotten from teaching this one class. Like I sort of could psychologize the substituting of time, in that way. And I basically rewrote the second half in like 3 months because I like sort of fueled by sheer panic, really. Just like, I might be writing this book until I'm 80. So I feel like the darkest moments were just those moments of like, what am I doing? Like I am somehow mostly a mom. Which is a thing I always wanted to be, and it's a wonderful thing, but there was this whole other plan for myself that my type A brain had, and I just definitely despaired at various points. So the despair was the dark part.
That feels familiar. I guess I'll give one sort of emotionally difficult thing and then one sort of technical. So a few months after my book sold, my mother died of ovarian cancer. And this actually becomes a little technical too. So my agent and editor were wonderful and compassionate, and I did get, I got an extension, but I kind of knew for myself that I needed to do this. So I was going to have to write, this book. Maybe I could take a little bit extra time, but the way to do it was unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but it was simply going to have to be to do it, even though I was grieving pretty intensely. As the book makes pretty clear, my mom and I were very, very, very close, and very dear to me. And she was the first person very, very close to me that I ever lost. And my mom as Claire mentioned, turns up in the book. And so one of the, when I am incorporating personal anecdote, I like to have some distance. I feel like distance tends to be a useful thing in writing about something that is personal. And so recognizing the fact that there were anecdotes that I felt like the book really needed, that involved my mother, and that I was going to have to work through, even when I was feeling about as unclear as I possibly could have. I was in a fog, and I had to somehow kind of find some clarity. And, and I also had to recognize, the perfectionist in me had to recognize that I'm gonna do the best that I can. I can only write this from where I'm sitting. And because, and this is sort of connected to what was the other thing that was so difficult, is that because I tend to be interested in sort of generically promiscuous books, and that tends to be the way that I think, I knew that my book was going to have a lot of different threads, but I also wanted to be really rigorous about what I was choosing to tell of myself, and what I wasn't, and that was really tricky. It was really hard, and I would be lying if I said that I wasn't most of the time really nervous about whether I was able to strike that balance.
Mm. That's fine. And I think we can probably do one more. Claire, this is for you from Chaya. Can you talk a little bit about David and what he represents? I think this is okay. Anyway, Chaya would like to know. He felt to me like a great example of so many people who claim to believe in something but fail to back it up with action, and then fall back on their ingrained privilege.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think, so David is a character that I liked much better at the start of writing than I did by the end of writing. I just feel kind of done with him. And I think Caroline feels kind of done with him. So he is her father's acolyte. And she is very drawn to him at the start of the story, but I think it turns out that a lot of what she's seeing in him is sort of something that she herself has put there. And so I think that so he represents that to me, because I think that's a very familiar situation, or at least it is in my life, of sort of early on, because Caroline is 29, but she's really an adolescent in some ways. She's had such a sort of sheltered life and such a small life that she's really not had a chance to experience much of anything romantically or in any other sort of direction. And so this is really sort of her earliest full-fledged romantic attachment, is her longing for this guy. And I think that when you're early on in your sort of romantic story, it's very easy to confuse what you want to see and what you are seeing. And I think she does do that. And I also think he just doesn't quite, he means well and he believes in Samuel, but he doesn't have sort of he doesn't really have the strength of character to believe in anything past the point where it becomes too hard. And so I think he sort of represents that too. Which I think is a common thing. Hard thing.
I was so mad at him by the end.
Yeah, I was pretty mad at him.
Screw you, David.
Well, I'm looking at the hour. We're almost there. I think it's in it. So I just guess I just wanted to say thank you to both of you so much for spending the time with us, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. I'm going to turn this over now to the wonderful Evan Karp, who has some parting words. Evan.
Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Rachel. This was fantastic. It's been wonderful to have you both here. And I want to thank everybody who's been organizing for Lockdown Lit. We're excited to host this as a series ongoing every Tuesday here at 11 a.m. Pacific time. So I'll drop the links to Claire's and Rachel's books in the comments again. Thank you all again for joining us. We're back next week with Aaron Summers, and in Mary South. I hope you can join us for that. And I hope that that you guys grab these books and we'll send them straight to your door. Thank you to Oscar and Zyzzyva for doing this, Oscar, and for joining us. Claire, Rachel, congratulations on your books, and thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Such a pleasure.
Most welcome. Be well, everybody.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.